Okay, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm Gordon Andrews. I'm a professor of history at Grand Valley State University, where I specialize in labor history and history education.
Nice. All right, so what do you think of when you hear the word masculinity?
Yeah, I think you automatically get thrown into some of those stereotypical genders,
Mm-hmm.
but it's obviously much more fluid than that.
Yes. Yeah. So thinking back to when you were in high school and in school, and you had those friendships with other boys your age, do you think that there was ever like a standard for masculinity that you had to live up to, or restrictions that you faced within your friend relationships because you were trying to uphold masculinity?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because most of the friends I had were related to sports.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and we wrestled, and so there was a certain amount of masculinity that sort of is imbued in that sport, but at the same time, I don't think it was a contest,
Mm-hmm.
but in a way it was,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you still have to be the person who's wrestling varsity, not the person who's JV or
For sure.
not competing.
Yeah. How, if at all, do you think that societal definitions of masculinity and societal expectations have shaped your own understandings of manhood?
No, that's quite a bit,
Yeah.
right? The whole nature, nurture.
Mm-hmm.
In my family, sports were sort of there. My grandfather was an international weightlifting referee, did like the world championships, and he had junior world team members at his house. So there was that expression of masculinity. These are people who are strong,
Mm-hmm.
extraordinarily strong,
Mm-hmm.
and good at what they do. And on my grandmother's side, she had two professional baseball players that were nephews, Joe and Phil Negro.
Mm-hmm.
So just by circumstance, that those sort of defining characteristics of masculinity at a really high level
Mm-hmm.
were always there, and yet there really wasn't any pressure for us to do that. We actually chased it a little bit. When I say we, I mean I have a brother that's a year younger than I am, so like we couldn't wait till we were old enough to be able to lift and be able to start doing that. So there are those moments where you kind of sit and think about the influences around you and how they move forward.
Yeah, for sure. What differences do you see now between how masculinity is perceived in more modern day times and portrayed versus how it was when you were younger and growing up?
No, it's a pretty stark difference.
Mm-hmm.
Being a person of a particular age, it gets easy to say that, some of the earlier stereotypes, like, you didn't cry, you were able to take high levels of pain, or at least try
Mm-hmm.
to take high levels of pain. No emotional weaknesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're scared to death, you never let people really know you were
Mm-hmm.
scared to death. But then as you get older, you kind of shake that off as sort of the nonsense that it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think it's easier today, and clearly you can see that in all of the different cultural outlets on, whether it's sporting, acting, music. I mean, people are much more likely to be open and honest about what they're actually feeling.
Yeah, for sure. So you're a teacher,
Mm.
and you taught at like a high school level for a while.
Yeah, 22, 23 years.
Yeah, and that's a fairly female-dominated field.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did you ever feel that there were any challenges that you faced to your masculinity during that time, personally or societally?
No, it is kind of interesting. So on the one hand, just from a work standpoint, you're right. There are more women
Mm-hmm.
in the teaching profession.
Mm-hmm.
And for, earlier periods, it really was dominated by women because, earlier on in our history, you couldn't sustain yourself or a family but I was teaching in the 80s forward, and in history, it's also very gendered. So even though in teaching there are more women, in the middle and high schools, in history departments, it's still fairly gendered with men.
Oh, why do you think that is?
Oh, gosh, so many structural impediments in the way. But yeah, I mean, earlier on, 50s, 60s, 70s, I mean, the number of women who were discouraged from or steered maybe for going into certain feminine, less masculine jobs. And then now, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I have, in my own teaching at Grand Valley, for example, now in the capstone class I have that is, seniors getting ready to go into the teaching field, out of the 15 students I have, it's pretty much 50-50. So I think that speaks well of
progress.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very nice. So if you personally had to come up with a definition for masculinity based on your own lived experiences, I know it's a hard question, but what would you say?
Yeah, like I said, just from the time I was an adolescent to where I am now, those definitions change just from your own maturational part. When you're an adolescent, you think one thing, young adult, middle age. So my own definition of masculinity has really kind of come around to just being comfortable in your own skin.
Yeah.
It seems like you have to live a long time to be comfortable. It shouldn't be that way.
Yeah. Well, that's nice. That's all the questions I have. So
well, it was nice meeting you.
It was so nice to meet you. Thank you.
Very good. Very nice.
All right, so now I want to take this opportunity to go over interesting points of the interview and tie those back to hegemonic masculinity and the generational differences we see when trying to interpret hegemonic masculinity, and maybe how present hegemonic masculinity is now. I think the position of being born in the 60s is an interesting one because those who were born then are now existing kind of on the crossroads because they have the experiences of kind of the same experiences as my grandfather, but they also have the experiences of me because my father is still very present in the workforce, a teacher, being exposed to younger people quite often, raising children who are growing up right now and interpreting masculinity in different ways than within his childhood. I think that this interview definitely demonstrates that right off the bat with his with the uncomfortability that came with being asked to define masculinity. As a person who is aware that the way they grew up and the way that things are now are quite at odds with each other, it's so hard to answer. He even notes, I'm immediately brought to mind stereotypes, things that are no longer true, things that we no longer go by. This sort of crossroads of a generation is truly represented by the difference in response when I ask questions regarding earlier life and when I ask questions regarding later life. For instance, when I ask about high school and experiences with friends when in kind of adolescence, the responses were quite stereotypical. They were the competitiveness of masculinity, the physicality of it with sports and things of that nature. But when I asked questions about life now, how he would consider things now, they represented a more modern point of view that definitely turned away from hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity would not associate discomfort with the term masculinity. That's a modern day thinking that recognizes the fact that masculinity is not easily defined. Because what do you base it on? Another interesting thing from this interview was the mentioning of family and the impact that family has on masculinity. Because your family is comprised of people even, of older generations than you. And this also points back to the topic of generational differences. When you are growing up, you are influenced by your parents mainly, who are of a different generation, of a different mindset, of a different time. So when my father noted these feelings of having to keep up a family reputation of masculinity, and that masculinity being very rooted in athletic performance specifically, but physical performance generally, that is something that aligns mostly with hegemonic masculinity, and that is something that is a nod back to my grandfather's interview, where physicality was present quite often. When I asked a question about the difference between masculinity then versus now, the answer was that it's a pretty stark difference. And what was immediately brought to mind as a point of reference is the ability to show emotion and emotional vulnerability. We have seen a movement towards the ability to, as a man or as a person presenting masculinity, be emotionally vulnerable and not lose any of that masculinity. The concept of hegemonic masculinity invokes a sense of strength that cannot allow for tears or sadness or weakness in any way. The masculinity that we see now is strength in showing emotions, strength in communicating feelings, strength in having feelings. When asked a personal definition, if he had to give one, there was, again, that sense of discomfort over having to even put words to the concept because it can be so limiting. And the answer, being comfortable in your own skin, is truly representative of the emotional vulnerability that we now have and of the power that comes with being your truest form of yourself without thinking of societal structures that may disapprove. Hegemonic masculinity leaves no room for ignoring societal norms. Hegemonic masculinity is societal norms in the harshest of ways. The comment, "It seems like you have to live a long time to be comfortable," is a nod to the fact that hegemonic masculinity is something very ever present in adolescence to this day, I believe. In high school, in elementary, there are all those forces of competition, all that pressure to live up to the manly definition that you want to, that you feel has been impressed upon you by society. So you do have to live a long time to escape that. And I think that's something that we are moving into a time where perhaps you won't have to live that long to be comfortable. Perhaps you can be comfortable in adolescence, in high school, in college, while also being your truest self and not having to worry about presenting yourself in a way that is expected. Being on such a crossroads of the progression of society, seeing the traditional values and then living through the change to what we now know as masculinity, there is so much learning and unlearning that comes with that. And I think that this generation, the boomers, the Gen X, is really taking the brunt of that because they are still so active in all realms of society. They're still in the workforce, they're raising children, and they're forced with this task of really confronting their past definitions of things and deciding whether or not they're going to be open-minded to change. And I think that this interview was very revealing that was an acceptance of change, and that was happiness to unlearn hegemonic masculinity as a strict societal standard. And I think that's a testament to the freedom that can come with that.